All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're unpacking a seriously fascinating analysis of an ancient text known as Surah Al-Kahf. But listen, we aren't approaching this as some dry standard history lesson, not at all. Instead, we're looking at this source material as an actual excavation of human consciousness. As you'll see, we're going to explore how these ancient, highly symbolic texts were literally designed to push the absolute limits of human intellect. To navigate all this dense material, we're using 5 layers of truth as our map for this explainer. We've got the meaning dig, allegory and truth, knowledge versus wisdom, power and justice, and finally, free will and the butterfly effect. Let's jump in. So, layer 1, the meaning dig, unearthing concepts. The speaker in our source material introduces this really powerful central metaphor right from the get-go. They argue that reading a text like this, it requires serious, hard mental labor. It's an archaeological dig, an excavation of concepts. It's highly symbolic stuff. It is absolutely not something you can just casually skim over while drinking your morning coffee. No, it's meant to be aggressively dug into. You're supposed to break a mental sweat to find the treasures buried beneath the surface. So the crucial takeaway here is that this ancient text intentionally uses what's called a symbolic method. By using elliptic storytelling and deep metaphor, it forces your brain to work so much harder. Think of it exactly like physical exercise. Just as a muscle only really grows when it's pushed to its absolute limits and forced to adapt, human consciousness expands when it grapples with these complex symbolic puzzles. It's a workout for your mind. Moving right along to layer 2. Allegory and truth, the danger of literalism. Now, this brings us to a very concrete example from the text where we encounter the deeply paradoxical parables of Moses and the wise servant. The source highlights a story where a wise servant commits 3 completely jarring acts. They're wild. He damages the ship of poor workers who offered them a ride. He actually takes a young boy's life. And then he freely repairs a wall for a deeply hostile town. The speaker explains that these completely paradoxical acts are profound mysteries. They are deliberately placed there to genuinely shock the reader's moral compass. So how in the world do we resolve this paradox? Well, the speaker does this by drawing a very strict distinction between literal reality and symbolic truth. Outwardly, the literal reality of these actions is brutal, right? It seems totally unjust. But the hidden truth represents a divine justice operating on a level that humans simply cannot see. And this is exactly why this matters. The absolute essential takeaway here is that these literal actions cannot and absolutely must not be replicated as human law. And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates the speaker's stark warning. Taking deeply symbolic, allegorical text literally leads to horrific real-world consequences. As the quote goes, when allegory becomes literal in the hands of the ignorant, it becomes murder. When human beings try to act like the divine force in the story, completely bypassing human law and justice, it literally becomes murder. The explainer impartially points to historical examples to really hammer this point home. The speaker notes how power has frequently weaponized literalism throughout history, whether it was extremist cults like the Harjites attacking their neighbors, or the Ottoman Empire's actual law of fratricide where rulers eliminated their own brothers. In both of these cases, a twisted, literal interpretation of religious concepts was used to justify brutal political crimes. So, you see, this isn't just ancient history. It's a timeless warning about how power weaponizes texts. All right, that brings us to layer 3, knowledge or wisdom, the dual nature of intellect. Knowing facts is very, very different from understanding how to actually use them. The speaker argues here that knowledge without a moral compass is fundamentally catastrophic. It leads straight to arrogance and destruction, much like the creation of the atom bomb. On the flip side, though, knowledge paired with wisdom builds human dignity, consciousness, and humility. That is the kind of intellect that drives true scientific discovery and enlightenment. To show us what a society that prioritizes that kind of wisdom actually looks like, the source shares this awe-inspiring look at the Abbasid House of Wisdom. Past leaders prized knowledge so highly that scholars literally mapped the Earth's coordinates by hand in 820 CE. And incredibly, just 10 years later, Caliph al-Ma'mun traded actual physical gold to buy ancient Greek philosophy texts from his military enemies in Byzantium, just to preserve human wisdom. It is absolutely amazing to think they prize learning so much they'd fund their own enemies just to secure it. Moving into layer 4 now, power and justice, the tale of the two-horned ruler. This brings us to the fascinating philosophical relationship between power and justice, which the source analyzes through the story of Dhu al-Qarnayn, or the two-horned ruler. It poses a really timeless rhetorical question for us. Does every ruler who gains immense power inevitably become a tyrant? Think about human history for a second. It's a completely valid concern, and it perfectly sets up the speaker's analysis of what a genuinely righteous ruler actually looks like in this ancient text. The speaker argues that Dhu al-Qarnayn was the exact opposite of a tyrant. Unlike conquerors such as Alexander the Great, who literally demanded to be worshipped as a god, this ruler respected the cultural differences of the vulnerable tribes he encountered. And here is why this matters. He used his intellect and hard resources, like iron and copper, not to conquer or destroy, but to build protective barriers. He used his power strictly to stop tyranny and shield the oppressed. This really brings us to the core political philosophy of the explainer, which is incredibly striking. The speaker firmly asserts that power without justice is entirely illegitimate. Period. If a state's power does not actively convert into justice for its people, well, the speaker argues that state devolves into nothing more than organized banditry. Just organized banditry. It's a powerful concept. And that brings us to our fifth and final layer: free will and the butterfly effect. Leaving your mark. Ultimately, all of this excavated wisdom culminates in how we actually exercise human free will. The speaker introduces the concept of the butterfly effect here. You know, just as a meteorologist once theorized that the tiny flap of a butterfly's wings in Africa could eventually cause a massive hurricane across the globe, our human free will operates in the exact same way. The tiny, everyday, individual moral choices we make, when they're truly rooted in wisdom, can ripple outward to completely change the reality of the world around us. And this leaves us with a really provocative final thought from the source. Can you leave a butterfly effect in your own sphere of influence? It challenges us to reflect not just on what we've learned today, but on how we are actually going to apply this excavated wisdom to our own daily choices. The dig doesn't end here, folks. It starts right now with your very next choice.